This week on the Newscast podcast, we've been discussing the beginning of the ceasefire in Gaza as President Trump added to the tally of wars he claims to have settled.
Yesterday I was saying 7, but now I can say 8. The hostages are back. The hostages are back.
But how secure is this ceasefire in Gaza?
You've got an Israeli government that is absolutely opposed to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. And the rest of the world, or most of it, saying there has to be a Palestinian state. It's hard to see how this is going to happen.
And Chris and I stayed up to do some late-night analysis of some late-dropping legal documents related to a major news story. I even did some stapling tonight as a result of all of this.
Oh my goodness me, there'll be a ring binder next.
What does all of that add up to? We will discuss on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the Newscast studio.
And we're joined by Panorama filmmaker Jane Corbin. Hello, Jane.
Hello.
You've been appearing on lots of our podcasts lately, so thank you very much.
It's been a busy week.
And also in Washington, D.C. is Caitriona Perry. Hi, Caitriona.
Hello, a busy week here too.
Well, and we will talk about lots of the big momentous things that have happened this week. But just as we're recording this episode on Thursday evening, a bit of breaking news where you are, Caitriona. Donald Trump's had a marathon phone call with Vladimir Putin, which is interesting in itself. But he's also now going to have another set of face-to-face talks with the Russian president, this time in Hungary.
Yeah, really interesting developments. They spoke for 2 hours, we're told, according to the White House. Very productive call was how President Trump described it. The Kremlin has said it was extremely frank and trustful was the word that was used. And on the basis of that, there are to be some high-level talks next week with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, here, and some Russian officials, which ultimately will lead to another summit between President Trump and Putin. This time, as the president has said in his Truth Social post, it will be in Budapest in Hungary. No date set on that, but we did hear from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt shortly after the phone call had ended, and she was saying the president's very enthusiastic about this, wants to get things going, alluded to the great peace he had restored to the Middle East earlier in the week, and he wanted to kind of build on that momentum. And of course, he'll have President Zelensky here tomorrow, so she said he'll be talking about the phone call and what was discussed with President Putin with President Zelensky tomorrow.
And Caitriona, is there any sense of some substance of like the gears shifting here? Or is this just more kind of the potential for more visuals like we saw in Alaska? Because actually that was a big visual moment that didn't really lead to anything changing in the world.
I mean, really nothing came out of that meeting in Alaska, right? So as to what happens now, I mean, if you're to be very cynical, you would be looking at this and saying President Trump about to meet with President Zelensky. We've heard a lot of chatter all week long about Tomahawk missiles. That's what President Zelensky is looking for. He's meeting some defense companies while he's here in the US. He actually gets in tonight. And so, you know, if Ukraine could get a Tomahawk missile, experts say that would completely change the game in terms of being able to launch a missile straight from Kyiv to Moscow and cause huge amount of damage. So if you're being cynical, you say, well, hold on, before that meeting, when that's about to be discussed, President Putin and President Trump have a meeting. And we've heard President Trump say before that he sometimes feels that he in the past has been played a bit by President Putin, that he hasn't been serious about peace talks. Of course, originally he thought he was very serious about peace talks. So there's this kind of back and forward, call it statecraft, call it what you will, about leading up to the conditions of this meeting with President Zelensky tomorrow. No mention from President Trump in the Truth Social post that he put out about those Tomahawk missiles.
Jane, you were having a very interesting conversation with our colleagues on Ukrainecast about whether peace deals could be infectious, whether the success Trump has had in the Middle East might lead to similar success with Ukraine and Russia. What was your theory that you ended up with in that podcast?
Well, it just shows how much has changed in a couple of days. I think it's more likely now. I did say then that I felt that President Trump was on a roll. And of course, he would look to the next down the list, and that would be Ukraine. So I'm not surprised. And I noted that it was interesting. His press secretary said tonight that he deserves great credit for moving on so quickly after the Gaza-Israel deal. So I think that's in the mind of the White House and Trump, that they need to be seen to seize the initiative. So I suppose in that sense, you could say that maybe, you know, peace breaking out is a little bit contagious. But we've just heard, there's a long way to go. We don't know when the meeting will be. We don't know what's going to happen about the Tomahawk missiles. But it's interesting as well that there's a bit of a carrot and stick going on, because I understand the Senate is also talking about a bipartisan bill whereby they would have enhanced sanctions on Russia. So you sort of feel that, Putin is noting all of this going on, not just with Trump, but what's happening in Congress as well. And perhaps that's all part of it, rather than it just being contagious.
And actually, Chris, we haven't heard Keir Starmer talking about Russia, Ukraine for a little while now. His focus has been on the Middle East, but this will force him to go back to it. And also, I'm just thinking how different this feels from the last time Trump had his meeting with Putin in Alaska. Then he met with Zelensky, and a whole load of European leaders went to Washington, and it was like drama, movement. And then...
Yeah, I think what's been intriguing, witnessing the Prime Minister's outlook on the President's conversations around Ukraine, and indeed that of plenty of other European leaders, is a sort of sense of trying to keep the President interested in it, and as European leaders would see, basically on the right side of the argument. That sense that the President has blown a bit hot and cold on Ukraine. The ultimate example, all the way back in February in the Oval Office, to language that has been very, very different, and expressing a frustration with Vladimir Putin. I think there's a recognition, a bit like, exactly like the Middle East question, that all roads point back to the White House in terms of trying to get some sort of deal, assuming the President is sort of sufficiently focused on it. And you can see the logic from his perspective of trying to keep the momentum going after his visit to the Middle East. But I suspect, Downing Street will think this is great that he's willing to be engaged, and clearly has this desire to be seen to be the peacemaker. But crucially, what is America willing to do in the Ukrainian context if, and clearly this is still an if, but when you get to the point of some sort of not just ceasefire, but the next stage beyond that, the security guarantees question.
Yeah, and, Trump's language changed massively from basically saying that Putin was a paper tiger and suggesting that Ukraine might win back territory, which was very different from what was going on in February with that disastrous meeting with Zelensky. You've got no cards, in the White House.
Ukraine was going to have to give up territory
exactly. So we've seen a big, big change. And as you say, Keir Starmer will be looking at that, and all the European leaders, and hoping to hold Trump's feet to that particular fire right now.
Because as you say, Jane, he has occupied pretty much the polar extreme positions in public on that. So where can he get to? And then, as I say, crucially from Europe's perspective, what is America's bottom line in terms of a sustainable long-term solution if you get to the point that there is a ceasefire?
Caitriona, though, it's interesting. Trump seems to have undergone this transformation. And I'm thinking about first-term Trump, where Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister then, said he's like the Incredible Hulk. He just goes in and smashes everything up. The Incredible Hulk has sort of now transformed to sort of like, he paints himself as a bit of a living saint, just going around solving the world's problems.
Well, he would say maybe he's solving the world's problems by smashing up the traditional playbooks and not playing by the rules. But when you're talking about the European leaders here, a key thing that has struck me from what we've heard about this phone call is the location of this meeting, or the proposed location of Budapest, Hungary. Hungary is an EU member state. It's also a member of NATO. It is currently a member of the International Criminal Court, although it has started the withdrawal process, but it's still a member until June of 2026. There is an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for Vladimir Putin. So if he travels to Hungary, technically Hungary is still obliged to arrest him. It also makes a tremendous headache for the other EU member states, because you would have someone who has an International Criminal Court arrest warrant in one of your member states. So the selection of this location, we don't know whether it came from President Trump or President Putin. Both of them are incredibly friendly with Viktor Orban. But you would suspect there's an element of trolling of the EU in the selection of that location specifically.
Although Viktor Orban trolling the EU and Viktor Orban being a fly in the EU ointment is a tale as old as time, as I can tell you from many years ago covering things in Brussels, where half the stories were Brexit and the other half the stories were Hungary taking taking the mickey out of the EU, and the EU struggling to know how to respond. Right, let's talk about the other big international story this week, Jane, the ceasefire in Gaza. I just caught myself there because I nearly called it a peace deal. But it's not really a peace deal, is it? Or is it? Discuss.
Well, it's a ceasefire and a return of hostages to Israel, and on the other side, Palestinian prisoners and detainees back to Gaza and the West Bank. But it's not a peace deal. It's the famous 20-point Trump plan. I think it's only points 2 and 3 that have been satisfied, and there's quite a lot still to get to grips with. Especially the disarming of Hamas. And we've seen that develop this week. We've seen what appears to be video of summary execution, Hamas, getting rid of some of the clans that they, not only vie with them for power, but that they accuse of being collaborators with Israel, and how far back the Israeli army draws, because they're still in more than 50% of Gaza. And then, of course, the big question, what happens to Gaza? Who governs it? All of those have to be really resolved before you can talk about a peace deal, especially when there are armed people on the streets and, it's mayhem.
We'll explore some of those points in a second, but here is international editor Jeremy Bowen with his big picture take on the last week or so.
Hello, newscasters. It's Jeremy. I'm in Jerusalem. I've been away from the UK for a couple of weeks in the Middle East, and it's actually been a remarkable time. First of all, Donald Trump bulldozed through his 20-point plan for the future of Gaza. Now, Hamas were under pressure from the Qataris and the Turks, as well as from Trump, but I think what really told was the pressure that Trump put on the Israelis to get them to the table and keep them there. I think Hamas was persuaded that the hostages were no longer useful to them, that they were a liability, and if they let them go, there would be an end to the war. And so far that is holding. The ceasefire is holding. Hasn't been long. There's been a few cracks appearing in it, but let's cross our fingers that it keeps on going. I suppose the big question now is what happens next.
And Caitriona, is there a sense that Donald Trump is as focused on what happens next as he was focused on getting the deal in the first place? Does he care about the stuff that Jane was talking about a second ago, about rival clans battling it out on the streets of Gaza?
Well, he's just put a Truth Social post out in the last few minutes saying, if Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, he says, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So that tells you where the president stands on Hamas. But the big question being asked here in Washington, D.C. is exactly what you say there, Adam. How long can the president's attention be kept on this? Because he is widely credited by people on both sides of the aisle for the pressure that he's put on in the last just 2 or 3 weeks on this, being the deciding factor to get this action, to get us to where we are now with this ceasefire. Although, as you were saying there, the peace plan is still kind of a long way off being completed. So that's the focus here. As long as there is an element of success attached to it, I think his attention will remain there. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, they were in Gaza over the weekend. They've been talking about kind of what they saw there, what they feel needs to happen there. We saw that incredible love-in Sharm el-Sheikh on Monday, where world leaders were literally queued up in a conference room to walk on stage and shake the president's hand and pose for a photo. That's the kind of thing that Donald Trump absolutely loves. So if he thinks there's another occasion for that to happen, his interest will remain. If he sees that it's slipping into the lose column, that's something maybe the attention is less held for.
And I think that the Americans are now a brake on the Israelis, because part of the deal was to return not just the living hostages, but the bodies of the hostages who had died in captivity. So far, of the 28, only 9 have been returned, and Hamas is saying it's very difficult for them to physically get the remains of the others. And this has resulted in Israel in real anger. And Netanyahu has a problem, the prime minister, with the right wing, who are standing up and saying, hang on, they were supposed to return all the dead hostages as well, the deceased, and really agitating for Israeli troops to go back in. But the Americans have said that as far as they're concerned, they need to be given a bit of time. This is not sufficient to break the agreement. So there's jockeying going on. And obviously the Trump administration doesn't want this to fall apart, and they're a moderating influence so far on Netanyahu. But it may be hard for that to stick.
Well, exactly, because isn't it interesting that Trump social post where Trump basically threatens Hamas saying we'll come in and kill you? That is very different from the language of the 20-point plan, which talks about a multinational stabilization force, a technocratic government of wise people managing Gaza for the benefit of Gazans, and an international peace board with people like Tony Blair on it, wrapping it all up in a nice, peaceful bow.
Yeah, and they talk about disarmament in the 20-point plan, not going in and killing them.
So it's already slipping.
It's already slipping, and the Americans are trying to keep it on track. Netanyahu is saying, we will go back if we need to, because the agreement was that we would have the deceased back as well as the living hostages, and he's under pressure from his right-wing coalition members.
Chris, it was interesting watching Starmer going to Egypt on Monday, and actually a lot of what people have seen will be that slightly awkward moment where Trump calls his name, he comes forward, it's not clear if he's going to speak, he ends up just shaking his hand and then going back to the row of schoolboys behind Trump. But what's the feeling in government about just how this has all gone for Starmer?
So I think there's two things going on which sound like a contradiction, but I don't think they are. So I mean, and this sounds A, very parochial, and B, in the grand scheme of things, probably quite trivial as well. But there was, because there kind of always is, a conversation in the UK politically, isn't there, about the relationship with a president in the United States and the extent to which it is subservient or not, or the degree to which it is subservient. And, you know, as we've said before in Newscast, one of the arguably unlikely triumphs of Keir Starmer's first year is the relationship that he's managed to build up with the president. And I think the view in Downing Street is you take every opportunity you can to burnish that, particularly at a moment where you can, without any sense of internal contradiction, compliment him on what he has done. Yes, there was that moment. It slightly reminded me of that moment at the G7 in Canada a couple of months ago, where there was the whole business of the president dropping his papers and the Prime Minister bending down to pick them up, and the really tortuous explanation that Downing Street tried to offer about he had to do that because if one of us had run up, then the security guys would have leapt in. Whereas actually, to be honest, he was just doing what a decent human being would do if the person next to you drops a load of papers. But they were acutely aware that the
person next to you is unlikely to pick them up himself.
Well, yeah, but the image obviously looked like he was sort of bowing at the feet of the president. So there's a bit of that. On the argument, as I say, very parochial one about, how much influence did the UK have? I think it was probably easy to overstate it in the macro. In the micro, Jonathan Powell, the government's national security advisor, I think genuinely did play quite a role in some of the negotiations. And that was acknowledged by Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy for Donald Trump, after we'd had that remark from the US ambassador in Israel, suggesting that it was delusional that the UK had played much of a role.
Not to get too micro on this, Jane, but I do want to use your expertise while you're here. And I'm thinking back, we did an episode of our series Old Newscast a few weeks ago about the Oslo Accords in 1993, that big, hopeful moment about a two-state solution. And I just always remember you being there with lots of the Palestinians who were negotiating and hanging out with Yasser Arafat and everything. What can you tell us about just how politics work and power works in Gaza that might help us set us up for the next few months about what's going to go on there?
Well, for a long time, and it wasn't true during Oslo, because Arafat was the power in the land, if you like, and all Palestinians looked to him. But the Hamas grew since then into a very powerful force. And the Palestinians were essentially split between those in Gaza, where Hamas ruled, and those in the West Bank. And, we've seen the leader of the Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, the heirs to Arafat, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, we've seen him really sidelined. And, it was only at the last minute that he was invited to Sharm el-Sheikh, and everybody's making decisions for the Israelis and the Palestinians. Actually, neither Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't there. And Mahmoud Abbas was only invited at the last minute. So I don't know. You sort of get the feeling that these are decisions being made almost without reference to the Palestinians. The Israeli government refused to deal with them, said they couldn't be part of what happened in Gaza afterwards. But who else is there? Until they had reformed their apparently corrupt practices. That's what they've been accused of. But, they are still they still hold a lot of popular appeal and support. And you have to sort of wonder who is going to be part of this peace board that runs things apart from Tony Blair and Donald Trump, who's actually going to be there, who's Palestinian and knows about the situation and is followed by the vast majority of people. It's very kind of flimsy.
And Caitriona, to bring it back to America and the domestic politics there, I'm intrigued that you're basically sitting in the middle of a ghost town at the moment because the federal government is shut down because of budgetary issues and a big domestic political battle. How does all this global gallivanting and solving wars, even though the number is disputed, go down in America domestically?
Well, traditionally, foreign policy is not, a big win on the ballot papers for voters, but President Trump doesn't have to worry about that himself, notwithstanding the jokes he often makes about going for a third term. And I think he may have realised that as a president and the power that you have in the foreign policy sphere, that actually he can get more done travelling around, meeting other world leaders. They have to take his call. He's the president of the United States. They have to engage with him in a way that, the Democrats and some of the domestic leaders don't have to. And things aren't going so fantastically well here in terms of economic indicators, in terms of everything that the president is trying to do, being subject to a legal challenge through the courts, unrest that we're seeing on streets, protests that we're seeing on streets. But he can look outwards from America, meet all these people who are his peers and equals, get treated the way he was in Sharm el-Sheikh on Monday. And you can kind of see that, as other US presidents have done in their second term, let's remember, he's kind of getting a bit of a taste for that.
And Chris, if we bring it back to matters domestic, Westminster's been consumed about this story that's been running for a couple of weeks now about spying by China in the UK and this trial of two guys who were accused of being spies for China, which collapsed. They deny the charges against them. And a very powerful statement from one of the men last night. I think I will remember for many years Wednesday night's very late night newscast where you and I were going through these documents with our highlighter pens, just trying to work out what was going on. And the documents in question were these 3 witness statements, which were written by the Deputy National Security Advisor and given to the CPS as part of that trial and released on Wednesday night by the Prime Minister to try and contain the story as far as he was concerned.
And I will forever remember standing in front of a camera in the dark on the 10 o'clock news, reading these things in 2.5 minutes during the piece that I'd recorded in advance going out, and then discovering that it's actually quite hard to read verbatim quotes from a piece of A4 in the dark. Lesson learnt about darkness.
But what we concluded in the dark was that these documents weren't either an end to the matter or a smoking gun that proved anything conclusively.
Completely. I think what they told us was what we've known for some time, but you hear it in the language of those who we wouldn't normally hear their quotes exposed to daylight, which is this tremendous dilemma that I think, for all of the detail and the nuance, and to what some people might feel like the Westminster Village getting very excited about various figures that are not widely known of, like the Deputy National Security Advisor, seems to me it's a case study in this challenge that the UK and the wider West are going to face in the decades ahead. How do you deal with this, in the grand scheme of things, blink of an eye, massive expansion economically, geopolitically, diplomatically of China in the last couple of decades, where there is an economic reliance, let's be blunt about it, but there is also an awareness of a country of a wildly different worldview where espionage, spying in the UK and elsewhere is significant. And we've got a sense of that from the documents that were published. And okay, there's a subtle difference of view between the last government and this one. This one has had an instinctively mildly warmer stance towards Beijing. But the previous government, as the documents highlighted, and we discussed on that issue of Newscast, wanted an open and constructive relationship. The current government described it as positive, whilst at the same time being aware of the dangers and the threats. And I just think we're going to see case studies in this over and over and over again.
And Jane, we're basically doing your greatest hits tonight because you've done a series of documentaries, including one where you uncovered a big Chinese intelligence operation.
Yeah.
Give us some things to think about how China operates in this space.
We made a film called China's Magic Weapon, which is about a little-known arm of the Chinese Communist Party called the United Front Work Department. And they run influence operations and espionage operations around the globe. And we pointed this out in 2021, just before these allegations were made against these two men. And I think that we've known for a long time that they play the long game. So China puts people into organisations. It would seem that the accusation here, or the allegation, is that they penetrated Westminster through a parliamentary aid and through an academic, and they waited out. And so not only are they using espionage and influence, they're also using cyber warfare. Lots of this came out in this witness statement that Chris was referring to. There's quite a lot of detail on exactly what China has been doing, which I think wasn't news to all of us, but it's laid bare now in what should have been quite secret or certainly private documents. And so the question for the government is, what do you do about China when, as you say, the inner workings have been laid bare? But it's very difficult because these two men have been accused of spying. It's been alleged, serious things have been alleged against them, and yet they haven't had their day in court. And it's very difficult to know what happens. What happens to them. And that one of them has put out a statement, but I think
they both have now.
It's a mess, basically.
Yeah,
don't you think, Chris?
Well, yeah, because from their perspective, this document comes out. Yes, we repeatedly say, because it's true, they have always maintained their innocence, but in their statements they make the point that the conclusion, and some might argue about this, but factually the conclusion of the Crown Prosecution Service, one of whose central jobs is to determine what should go before a court on the basis of a reasonable judgment about the likelihood of a conviction, they've concluded there was an insufficient likelihood to put it before a court. So these two gentlemen don't get the chance to put their side of the story in court, having been acquitted prior to a trial, and are now making arguments in each of their public statements where they fear or are experiencing, they claim, a unfair trial by media, because even though the principal reason for the news value around this story is not actually the two of them, it's the wider case study in this tangled and awkward relationship with China. Of course, in the reporting of it, not least because their names and allegations about them are all over the documents, then they are mentioned and referred to. So in that sense, they have both said, certainly one of them in their statements, trying to put their life back together and all the rest of it. But at least for now, and I guess, with the longevity of digital fingerprints and whatever, in terms of, stuff sitting on the internet, that there's all of this stuff that's there, whilst they say, look, not only have we always maintained our innocence, we never had the chance to put our side in court.
And if we zoom out to the bigger picture of UK-China relations, Caitriona, an interesting thing's been happening the last few days amongst the China hawks at Westminster, the people who say they've been banging the drum about the threat of China as they perceive it for a long time. They often say, just wait till the Americans get involved. The government will have to get much tougher on China when President Trump realised just how much China stuff there is in the UK. Do you think this is something that Trump will weigh into? I mean, the Americans have waded into it before when Theresa May was Prime Minister and Huawei was going to have a role providing 5G mobile phone coverage in the UK.
There is no ambiguity when it comes to this Trump administration as to the threat that they see from China. I mean, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State Marco Rubio here said recently it is the number one challenge to the US on every front that he can think of, be it geopolitics, be it economics, be it industrial fronts, be it national security, defence, everything. China is at the forefront of every policy here. The FBI has it as their number one threat level as well in terms of counterintelligence and economic espionage from China. We saw the whole thing with TikTok here, legislation with bipartisan support because of the threat to national security that it was perceived that TikTok posed because of its Chinese ownership. So everything that this administration in many ways does is informed by its views towards China.
Caitriona, thank you very much.
Thank you, as always.
Jane, great to see you.
Thank you.
And to talk about your extensive back catalogue of panoramas about all these subjects. And Chris, good to see you too.
And you.
And that's it for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.